Good morning. This is the last class in the fall 2014 term. And I want to finish up on foreign policy, U.S. foreign policy. My approach is to, in general, agree with Max Weber that while there should be morality in politics, it's rare. And in international politics, it's virtually non-existent. This is a descriptive rather than a normative statement. I might wish it'd be different, but the world isn't constituted to fit with my own preferences, or for that matter, anyone else's. So my view is that international politics and foreign policy is hardball with a capital H. And for much of the morning, I want to discuss the American torture and the Senate Intelligence Committee report on torture that was released last week. Hey guys.
There you go. Yeah.
Good morning.
Good morning. Finally.
Welcome back. I can't see you guys yet.
There you go.
Okay. So we're about 5 minutes late, and I want to be able to finish up, and I have a terrible cold, so I'm going to start moving things pretty quickly here. We are recording. This will be available online as far as I know. I will update the PowerPoint on the website as well. Basically I've done one slide so far, and to cut to the chase, I've said I may not like it, you may not like it, but in my judgment, foreign policy is basically hardball with a capital H, and morality has little place or room in international affairs. Not my preference, but it seems to me that's the way the world works. I want to spend a good bit of time talking about the American torture and the Senate Intelligence Committee report on torture released last week. And so there are two main lines of commentary coming from political officials, and there have been some good articles on American torture as part of foreign policy and as part of the quote-unquote war on terror. But the two official lines that one hears from political officials are both wrong, and I'd like to talk about that briefly and then to tell you what I think the right line is, the right interpretation is, or the best interpretation, maybe a better way to put it. First, there are those who are either naive and or disingenuous. They say, this is not who we are. We should not do this. We didn't know we were engaged in torture over an extended period. We won't or shouldn't do it again. And then there's the Cheney side, the defenders of torture. They want to kill us. We should do everything we can, including torture and violating or ignoring international laws and norms and our own constitution and laws to kill and defeat our enemies. Torture works. We should continue to use it and seek the help of other governments to implement a regime of torture to defend the homeland. I do it all again in a minute. Dick Cheney. So, with regard to the first group of people, anyone who paid attention before and after 9/11 knew full well that the United States engages in torture as a part of foreign policy. We didn't know is false. Almost none of the people who hold view one have lifted a finger to see that it doesn't happen again. So I call them charitably idealists without the courage of their convictions. They have not taken and probably will never take serious legislative or executive action to dramatically reform and restructure the U.S. intelligence community. Oops. Okay. The defenders, the Cheney group, they're paranoid. They live in an insecure and unstable world in their own fantasy land. Is it unstable and insecure? Yep, but not to the level of what they perceive. But one could also argue that torture is a norm in the American tradition. We have slavery, mass murder of Native Americans, the internment of Japanese during World War II, the Klan lynchings, wars against the Vietnamese and Iraq people. You have to start to consider the levels of violence in its various forms that Americans deploy. If you want to look at it in terms of culture, look at the difference between killings by guns in Canada, our neighbor to the north, per capita. We have 10 times as many people as they do, and the number of killings via guns in the United States. There's no comparison. Again, per capita. If it were equal, roughly there would be 10 times as many murders by guns or killings by guns in the U.S. than in Canada. It's ridiculously higher than that. So the Cheney side, the defenders of torture, recognize there are no niceties in international affairs. It's a brutal game, and the most brutal tend to be relatively successful. They follow the philosophy of the baseball player and manager Leo Durocher. We should mention he wasn't a very good player. They believe that nice guys finish last. Now, what is unique in the current American torture regime is that we organize and outsource torture to other groups as well. Kind of like the mob flouting international law with impunity. Torture defenders realize there's no morality among a gang of criminals. So I call these guys Al Capone global criminals without conscience, or if you want to put it more in a gentler fashion, hard power realists. So I take a different view, as you probably won't be surprised. What torture defenders get wrong, among other things, is the meaning of torture. Torture is morally wrong. It is a violation of international norms and values and law. But it's also bad policy if one's policy goal is to defend the American people and American soldiers and personnel abroad. John McCain and Colin Powell are right on this. Torture doesn't work. It rarely produces accurate and actionable information from those who are coerced. Torture defenders have not produced evidence that it actually does work. They're going to say, well, this is classified information. We can't share this with the American people. Hello. It's a democracy. It's supposed to be a democracy. So if a policy works, show me it works. Show me. Just give me the evidence. I can deal with it. Okay. So I want to argue that a regime of torture does fail to defend the American people. What it does do, in my judgment, is create more animosity toward the United States and more terrorists rather than fewer. Torture is a policy whose impact is to produce more, not less terror. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. You engage in terror against alleged terrorists in order to reduce terror. It doesn't work. Indeed, the war on terror has not decreased terror, and I'm going to show you some data that supports that claim. My view here is shaped by two great political scientists, and Hans Morgenthau and Hannah Arendt, and they've both written about, former has written extensively about foreign policy and U.S. foreign policy more specifically. Hannah Arendt is a political philosopher who's written extensively on war and violence. So, this chart is provided by the Heritage Foundation, which is a very, very politically conservative group, quote, think tank. And you can see that from 2001 to 2012, there was a substantial increase in the number of terror plots, specifically against the United States. Going from 1 and 2 in 2001 and 2002, all the way to 9 in 2011 and 6 in 2012. So the number of terror plots directed against the United States that we know of, that they can count have been increasing, and increasing by a significant percentage. If one looks at high-casualty terrorist bombings, note that there was one in the past week in Pakistan, at least 140, I think 2 or 144 students in a Pakistani school. We can see that from this chart goes over a 20-year period, while high-casualty terrorist bombings don't go up every year over a period of 20 years. You can see that between 1992 and 2002, it was pretty steady, but there was a dramatic increase once the United States initiated its war on terror. And the chart here indicates what countries the terrorist bombings have occurred in. Note that a dramatic increase in terrorist bombings in Iraq, and Afghanistan's pretty steady. Here we have civilian deaths in Iraq over time. So maybe one of the alleged virtues of torture would be that terror caused by civilian deaths would be declining. In fact, what we see is just the opposite. There were fewer than 500, maybe closer to 400 per month. I'm sorry, roughly 400, 350 to 400 a month in 2011, and that's increased dramatically by threefold on average. And the last month of let's see, the data that we have, June, has almost 2,300 civilian deaths in Iraq. So clearly this trajectory is one that shows a substantial increase in civilian deaths caused by terror in Iraq. And here's an image of enemy-initiated attacks in Afghanistan. This is nationwide by month, and as you can see, it doesn't go up every month, but over time, that is to say between the middle of 2007 and 2012, roughly a 5-year period, one can see a steady increasing trajectory of enemy-initiated attacks over this 5-year period. And even the surge in adding American troops on the ground, as President Obama didn't really reverse this broader trend. So I think one can conclude from this that if the goal is reducing civilian deaths by terror, if it's reducing terror attacks in Afghanistan, if it's reducing the damage inflicted, the number of plots against terror plots against the United States, on a whole number of measures, the data are consistent. And what it shows, so what this leaves really is one argument for the defenders of torture. And that argument is, it would have been worse if we didn't torture. Of course, there's no way to prove that except to not torture and do some other things instead. We know that there's a whole range of foreign policy tools, and reliance on one is not that we didn't employ others, but certainly this one did not achieve what it is that it's said to achieve. So Hans Morgenthau was a foreign policy realist. He said nation states pursue and seek to defend their national interest. He believed that morality plays little, if any, role in international affairs. Whether it should be is an important question, he believed, but it generally doesn't. Hannah Arendt has a very interesting view on violence in political affairs. Her view, she's a political philosopher who has written widely on politics, war, and violence. Her argument in a little book called On Violence is that violence and war, and by extension torture, a form of violence, are signs of weakness in foreign policy and international affairs. Torture, like other forms of violence, is an admission that a political actor, say a nation state, is unable to achieve its policy goals using other, say, diplomatic, economic, cultural, policy tools and strategies. So her argument is, if you can't get your way in international politics any other way, you're more likely to resort to violence, and that violence, in fact, is a stark admission of policy failure. Again, this is not a moral argument. It's a pragmatic argument. It says you can't, and you can think about it in terms of your own family. All right, it's a stupid analogy, and a lot of my analogies are stupid, but I'll make it anyway. Your mother, you got a brother and a sister, and you. And so you got 3 kids in the family. Your mother brings home a chocolate cake. And your brother and sister collude and say, we're going to cut you out of the chocolate cake. And you say to them, wait, this isn't fair. This isn't right. There are 3 of us. We should split it 3 ways. And they say, get out of here. We're eating the cake. And they eat the cake. You couldn't persuade them to do otherwise. If, on the other hand, you hit them in the face and give them a bloody nose and they have to go take care of themselves and you eat the cake, you may get the cake or you may not. But if you do get the cake, you have to deal with the consequences of your relations with your brother and sister later, and you have shown that you couldn't gain the recognition and develop the policy skills to get them to see what was fair. So Arendt argues, and I agree, that war is usually also a very imprecise policy tool, and her argument's a pragmatic one. War and violence is an imprecise and generally ineffective policy tool for the following reasons. First, it's unlikely most of the time to achieve big policy goals. Notice I said most of the time. If you want to make the world safer democracy, if you want to end or significantly reduce terrorism, if you want to establish and maintain a stable, friendly, democratic government in another country in the world, if you want to rebuild a failed state, war is a bad way to go about it. War or violence is more likely to be successful if its aims are modest and short-term. I'm not saying that I necessarily advocate these things. I'm making a pragmatic means-ends argument rather than a moral one. So that if a government wants to assassinate a foreign political leader, that's something that's often achievable. It may not be a good idea, but it's achievable. If you wish to use drone strikes to take out terror leaders around the world, there will be a lot of other people, including wedding parties, who are killed, but it's something that you can do. Yeah, will it have blowback? Will there be opposition to this? Yes, there will. But at the same time, it's targeted, it's short-term. My argument doesn't always work. Sometimes violence doesn't even work in the short term. And the best case here is President Kennedy and the failure of the Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba more than 50 years ago. War, however, also has related policy consequences that are usually highly undesirable in a policy sense and in a human sense as well. First, we're talking about massive death and destruction as a consequence of war. Second, we're talking about hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions, in the case of Iraq, 4 to 5 million refugees who spill across foreign borders, spreading the conflict. Why spreading the conflict? Well, countries like Jordan, Turkey, Syria, they don't have the resources and capability to handle, such massive numbers of refugees. And so as people move from Iraq to other neighboring countries as well, that creates a vacuum in the country that they left because it becomes depopulated. So Iraq, for example, loses roughly 20% of its people in terms of refugees and lost lives. The domestic costs to the United States are excessive. The human costs are severe, especially for our soldiers, men and women who are in Afghanistan, who are in Iraq, who are deployed around the world, and then return from military combat. And war tends to mobilize new opposition abroad. Violence does this as well. Torture does this as well. It tends to spread violence rather than reduce it, as we saw from the data regarding the most recent military adventures in Iraq and Afghanistan. And then we have this. This is news this week. This whole slide is taken from USA Today. The Senate introduced a last minute before the end of the session a bill to prevent suicide among veterans. It's a very modest bill. It seeks to deal with the mental health issues faced by our veterans after they return. The House of Representatives approved the measure on December 9th. Senator Coburn, a Republican and a doctor no less, from Oklahoma, blocked quick passage of the bill. It would have cost $22 million over 5 years, but Coburn objected. Because he was able to make his objection stand in the Senate because of the way the procedures, the unusual procedures that were employed to bring the bill up. And so here we have a bill, a very modest, a very inexpensive bill to deal with the mental health needs and the suicides of our veterans, and one senator puts a stop to it and it doesn't become law. The legislative director for the Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America said it's clear something needs to be done. It's dangerous and dishonorable for one single senator to simply complain about and block efforts to combat the veterans' suicide crisis without having offered any alternative solutions of his own. The new head of the Veterans Administration, Bob McDonald, former CEO of Procter & Gamble, supported the bill, called it improving mental health care, a bill that would improve mental health care for our nation's veterans. He implored the Senate to pass the measure. It did not. It will soon adjourn for the year. Where is the data here? I lost. The last bullet point. It shows that the data indicates that about 22 veterans a day in our country commit suicide. This is from Veterans Administration statistics. So if you multiply that by 365, you're going to get something like, I think, 8,000 veterans a year. 22 a day times 365 is what, 8,000 veterans a year. 8,000. No attention paid to them. However, Citibank, no problem. Citibank literally wrote provisions in the budget bill that the Congress recently passed and that the President unfortunately supported to allow the big banks to engage in the very same practices that led to implosion of the American economy 6 years ago. And that provision written by Citibank lobbyists makes the American people, you and your parents, financially liable for losses that the banks incur by their playing with derivatives in the market. The very same thing that tanked the economy 7, 8 years ago. So the banks, okay, we got your back. Veterans, sorry, we can't help you. That's what your Congress did in the past 2 weeks. Finally, I called President Obama. I said, look, Barack, you have to do something here so that I can spice up the end of my lecture and the end of the course. He said, no problem, Charles. We'll take care of it. So as you probably saw in the last 24 hours, the president has announced, after a long, many months of negotiation, facilitated by the Pope and the government of Canada and his own administration, have announced that the United States would resume diplomatic relations with the nation of Cuba. Just so we're clear, I didn't call Barack. I mention this because this is a counterexample to what we found in one of your written assignments. Presidents can make a difference in foreign policy by using the powers that they do have that are enumerated in the Constitution. This is also a case that shows how difficult a policy change can be. The United States blockade of Cuba was an initial success measured by its ability to persuade the Soviet Union to remove its missiles from the island of Cuba more than 50 years ago. However, we also sought in various ways to overthrow the Castro regime after the Cuban Revolution, and that failed. And those failed, and the Cuban blockade, whose purpose was regime change in Cuba, also failed. It did contribute, among other things, to the misery of the Cuban people, but it also contributed to, I think it's fair to say, if one looks back at results, the blockade, the American blockade over time of Cuba probably increased the support of the Cuban people for the Cuban Revolution, because they probably saw themselves as, defending themselves against the big in their country, against the big American power, which, over the course of history has not always done right by the Cuban people. So one might ask, what's changed? Why this week would Barack Obama decide to recognize, to establish diplomatic relations with Cuba, other than he has the constitutional power to do it? I suggest several things, one of which I mentioned above here, but not below in the list of 4 bullets. Policy failed. If you have a goal, a policy goal, and you say, okay, I'm going to do X to achieve policy goal Y. Why? Policy goal Y being regime change in Cuba. And it doesn't work, it doesn't accomplish the objective in over 50 years, then that's pretty good evidence that the policy wasn't working. You weren't achieving your policy goal. Again, I'm not saying the goal was good. I'm not saying it was bad. I'm not saying it was in between. I'm saying if you wanted to walk across the street and you couldn't see the street so you couldn't walk across it, that's policy failure. You got to be able to get from A to B. If you can't get from A to B, then why are you doing A? And the answer is, well, that's what we've been doing for so long. That's all we know how to do. Well, that's not true. So, in fact, there were a number of factors that helped persuade the president, and would have persuaded any president that was paying attention to change the policy. First, over time, a growing number of Latin American governments came to oppose the blockade, came to oppose U.S. policy vis-a-vis Cuba. So that is probably a factor. More and more governments in Latin America and Central America were opposed to our policy. Secondly, Cuba is very, very close to the United States, and it represents tremendous new investment opportunities for American business. We are right next to Cuba. It's a lot easier for American businesses to get there than Chinese businesses, Russian businesses, European businesses, African businesses. We have a leg up in terms of geography because Cuba is so close. Why not make this economic opportunity available not only to American business, but to the people of Cuba? Thirdly, people who left Cuba around 1960 are not dead, almost all of them. New generations of Cubans, many in Florida, but many in other states, a few other states as well, especially, now support normal relations. They've lived their lives in a situation where they cannot connect meaningfully with their families. They want to be reunited. They want to live a normal life. They don't want to be told, well, you can't see your family members in Cuba, and your family members in Cuba can't come to the United States to see you. They want to reunite their families, a basic family value. And finally, Latino voters are a growing percentage of the American electorate, and they tend to vote close to 2-to-1 in most cases, Democratic. And Latinos have substantial political power in the state of Florida and dominate the political landscape of Miami and its region. And so this represents not just good policy, but a significant opportunity for the Democratic Party to win the long-term Latino vote, especially because the Republicans continue to be opposed to comprehensive immigration reform or any meaningful immigration reform in the Congress. And many of the presidential candidates, not necessarily all, but most of the Republican presidential candidates are pretty negative on anything that would extend the rights of Latino immigrants in the United States, and so that doesn't sit well, obviously, with Latino voters. So, while it appeared from the case of Guantanamo, it's interesting that my assignment was about the Guantanamo Bay prison. And there's something with regard to Cuba that involved Cuba, or at least the island of Cuba, that the president had great difficulty doing anything more than a few things step by step over a significant number of years. Now we see a case with regard to Cuba where the president can act pretty dramatically to change U.S. foreign policy vis-a-vis Cuba. Will there be some Republican opposition? Yes, undoubtedly there is. However, the Constitution is pretty clear on what the president can do with respect to recognizing foreign governments. However, keep in mind, the Congress still has the power of the purse. But in any event, I thought it would be useful to bring out this example this morning as a kind of counterweight to the case of Guantanamo Bay, the Guantanamo prison. I'd like to wish you all a happy holiday, and I hope the end of your term goes well, and I wish you a good and a happy New Year as well. That's really all I have to say. If you have any comments, we have a little bit of time, I'm more than happy to listen. Any comments? Make sure that you turn in all your assignments. You may know that Blackboard was messed around with it earlier this week, and so I hope it's all accessible to you now. It wasn't accessible to me either. In fact, this class wasn't even on my Blackboard for some time, and it was rather discouraging. So I hope you're able, if you're not able to access Blackboard effectively, you can always email me your work. Make sure, if you don't have a grade on things, make sure that you've turned in, what you've turned in is either in rich text format or in Word. Thanks very much. Have a great holiday.
Yours, I guess, or you might ask us.